All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome again to this webinar for educators on Muslim American history modules for the social studies curriculum. My name is Emma Harver and I'm the Director of Outreach for the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. And we are so thrilled to be here this evening with my colleague Yasmine Flodin-Ali from the Department of Religious Studies at UNC, who is going to be presenting on a number of resources that she has created to help social studies teachers incorporate more information on Muslim American history into the classroom and diversify some of the examples that you use in your classroom. So I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker this evening. Yasmine Flodin-Ali is an Islamic Studies PhD student in the Religious Studies Department at UNC-Chapel Hill, and her research focuses on the history of Muslims, race, and racialization in the US. Before coming to North Carolina, she obtained a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School. And she also has a background in interfaith and educational equity work and has spent a lot of time preparing some amazing curriculum units for you to use in your classrooms that are ready to go. And a quick overview of what we'll be exploring this evening. There are 3 units that Yasmine will be presenting on that highlight significant times in Muslim American history in the United States over a broad span of time. So hopefully some of these are applicable to you in the courses that you teach and that you can use some of these materials. And you'll see here the first is focusing on Omar ibn Said and enslaved Muslims in the US. The second is focusing on early American immigration, and then the third will focus on the Iran hostage crisis and specifically Iranian Americans. All of these materials that Yasmine will be presenting on are available at this website, and I'll put that in the chat momentarily so you can click and explore them and follow along throughout today's program.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to delve into this material. A couple of quick thank yous that I would also want to give out before we get started. Thank you to the Humanities for the Public Good who funded this project. Their institute works to recognize and catalyze publicly engaged scholarship at UNC. Thank you to Emma Harver for organizing this event, editing all of this curricula, and for everything that she does for the UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies, which involves a ton of programming. And mostly thank you everyone for being here tonight. I started off this project by interviewing K-12 teachers in North Carolina across the state. And I'm in constant awe to the commitment that educators have to making their classrooms transformative spaces. And just the amount of feedback that I got in this for only 3 lessons when I know how many lessons y'all are planning every day and every week was truly incredible. So I'm really grateful that you're here. And we're going to get started. So all of these units are intended for high school students in American history courses. If you have some very precocious middle schoolers, it's possible, but I would be impressed just remembering myself as a middle schooler. But certainly I think 9 through 12, this is appropriate for. So we're going to start off, like Emma said, with the Omar ibn Said and enslaved Muslims unit. Omar ibn Said, as you'll learn, was a man who lived in North Carolina. So I'm really excited for more students across the state to be learning about him. I think he's a figure that a lot of students will be able to relate to and think about in ways that are really critical and interesting. Can you see my screen? Can I get a thumbs up from anyone? Great. So I'm just going to kind of start us off with the overview, and then we'll kind of go through and actually learn about some of the content, because I know that y'all all know how to deliver stuff, but more exciting perhaps to focus on the actual content here that you might want to be sharing with students, which I'm assuming that we all have like different degrees of familiarity with, and that's totally fine. So all questions are valid, and I'm excited to hear. So this 2-day unit introduces students to the history of enslaved Muslims in the United States by focusing on the biography of Omar ibn Said. Omar ibn Said spent most of his adult life in North Carolina and is the only known enslaved person in the United States to write an autobiography in Arabic. We want to emphasize the US. There are people that we know about in Jamaica and some of the Caribbean who wrote autobiographies of their life, and I think kind of cool to tell students that if they're interested. This unit emphasizes the literacy of many enslaved Muslims and the multilingual and multi-religious nature of the United States from its earliest days. This unit also teaches students about transnational connections, especially between the antebellum South and West Africa. So with that, I'm going to pull up the first PowerPoint of the unit, which includes just sort of like background information, and we'll go through it together. And as I go through it, if there's any questions at all that you have, you can put them in the chat, and I'll get to them after the PowerPoint. I'm going to keep this in presenter view because I've got some notes in the bottom that I think might be helpful. And so I want you to kind of see it as you'll see it if you present this. So first slide is an introduction that enslaved people in the United States came from a variety of cultural backgrounds, and they brought with them their own spiritual practices and ethnic categories. I think this is one of the most immensely powerful things that we can teach students, that people, when they came to the US, even through the trauma and horror of the Middle Passage, were not blank slates, that they brought things with them that continue to influence the way that cultural practices developed in the US that even we can see today. I think that's super powerful. Anywhere from 5 to 20% of enslaved people taken to the United States were Muslim. Many more people came from backgrounds where their beliefs and worldviews were influenced by Islam because they had Muslim neighbors or their rulers or leaders were Muslim. Now, 5 to 20% is a massive range. I realize that. I wish I had better statistics for you, but the truth is that a lot of slave owners didn't really care that much about the people that they enslaved and didn't keep great records. So a lot of this is just based off of names that we find in ledgers of enslaved people, names based on runaway notices, and also approximating based upon where people came from. So largely we're thinking that most people who are enslaved Muslims are coming from West Africa and North Africa, though there may have been Muslims also in other places. Also, I think interesting to note that even if someone wasn't Muslim, they may have found Islamic practices to be important to them. And this is a kind of complicated concept, but the idea is that essentially religious beliefs are not always clearly bound. And so, for example, with Omar ibn Said, some of his neighbors thought that he was a magical man, even though they weren't Muslim. Some of the people who were around him who were enslaved were really drawn to his writings, even though they couldn't read Arabic. And partially this may have been because they had neighbors in their communities of origin who wrote and read in Arabic, and they recognized them as kind of people who had special knowledge. So it's kind of interesting to note that. I've got a note here that using the term enslaved instead of slave sort of places an emphasis on the condition that enslaved people were in. I don't know if you necessarily need to be a stickler about that language, but it might spark interesting conversation to expose students to that and sort of think about that concept of what kind of language we use to describe the people that we're talking about. A little bit more specifics on Omar ibn Said and his life. He was born in 1765. That's an approximate. We don't have an exact date, but just for sake of giving students a date, somewhere around there. In West Africa, in a place at the time of his kidnapping was called Futatoro. Today, that would be in contemporary Senegal. So you can definitely show students a map, but in fact, there's a math activity. It might be cool for them to see where that is now. He was from a well-off merchant family. He grew up being educated in Islamic schools and learned from a variety of texts, including the Quran and Sufi poetry. Students will have had a pre-activity to kind of like familiarize them with some basic tenets of Islam because it's pertinent to this unit. But the Quran is the holy book of Islam, much like the Bible for Christians, or the Hebrew Bible or the Torah, the Tanakh for Jews. And Sufi is a mystical version of Islam that often involves a lot of poetic practice. Important to emphasize that, it's amazing that he was literate and able to write. He definitely was from like a more prominent class background. That wouldn't have been the case from everyone where he was from. But even people from more prominent backgrounds occasionally ended up in crossfires. In his case, it seems like there was sort of like a war in his region and he just kind of fell into the wrong hands, and unfortunately was kidnapped. And again, there are other stories of enslaved Muslims, but because this is kind of targeted towards North Carolinian educators, I thought it'd be cool to start on sort of focus on Omar ibn Said. But if you're curious to hear other biographies, I can definitely get you that information after the talk. So when he was in his 30s, Said was kidnapped, enslaved, and brought to South Carolina. He escaped his first owner and made his way to Fayetteville, North Carolina, so not too far from where I am right now in Chapel Hill. And he was imprisoned. And then he wrote in Arabic on the walls of his prison cell, which attracted a lot of attention. People in the town thought that the writing was really beautiful. They wanted to know more about it. It attracted so much attention that James Owen, who was the brother to the governor of North Carolina, so a very prominent North Carolinian family, ended up purchasing Said, and he spent the rest of his life with the Owens until he died about a year before the Civil War ended. And here we've got some newspaper clippings that kind of just show that he was called by a lot of different names. And that might be interesting for students to think about, just the many different ways that he was conceptualized. People were trying to understand, particularly with the ideas that they had about enslaved people, how someone could be enslaved and also literate, kind of posed a question to racial conception at the time and racial binaries. While in North Carolina, Said wrote several documents in Arabic, and we're going to have students look at one of those, and we'll look at one of those today. He's the only known Arabic language autobiography written by an enslaved person in the US. He attended church with the Owens, was believed to convert from Islam to Christianity. Said's owners and the press used his alleged conversion as a justification for slavery. There's been a lot of debate about this, and I think it's a complicated question and not one students have to fully answer, but definitely something to kind of draw them attention to. Some of the documents that we're looking at include the Lord's Prayer, for example, but still begin with a supplication to the Prophet Muhammad. So what does that mean? Does it mean that he's a Muslim learning about Christ from a Muslim's perspective? Does it mean that maybe he believed in both? Can we really talk about someone who's enslaved having the freedom to convert when he was kind of made to go to church every week? A lot of hard questions, but I think interesting questions for students to think about. And kind of last note here, many enslaved Muslims in America could read and write in Arabic. However, not everyone could. Some people forgot, some people never knew, they weren't as well educated. Some people may have hidden their literacy out of fear of punishment, particularly as they get closer to the Civil War. That seems to be more of a concern. And just kind of like worth tying into other things that students might know, that the movement for mass literacy only started in Europe in the 19th century. So general literacy was still somewhat novel. We're going to dive into one of these documents now, which I'm really excited for. But any content questions first before we go on? Let me see if I can pull up the chat here. Sorry, Emma, I can't access the chat, but are there any questions before we go on to the next? And if not, that's great.
I'm not seeing any questions at this moment, but okay. Certainly if they arise as we engage with this primary source activity, we can definitely pose them.
Awesome.
And yes,
I'm going to be asking y'all some questions, so we'll definitely have some engagement in the chat for this next bit.
Excellent.
So the next thing we're going to be doing is looking together at a document from Omar ibn Said. And by the way, for pronunciation, whatever students can do is totally fine, but we're kind of going for Syed as opposed to Saeed. It's closer to like a S-A-Y-E-E-D sound, perhaps you could say. They're going to be looking at a podcast with Professor Ernst, who's a professor at UNC doing research on Said. So they'll learn a little bit more about him. And then they'll get to class, and like we are now, they'll be looking at this document together. So as we kind of look at this document a little bit, just kind of want to hear any first impressions. There's nothing that's a wrong thing to say. What are some things that you think of or that you notice when you first see this document? And anything at all will go. Nada says that you'll see some information about Omar ibn Said at the History Museum. Sue says to go down, definitely. Thank you, let's go a little slower. Surprised by the silver, okay, interesting. So really beautiful, kind of interesting use of materials. Might make us wonder where he got access to these materials. Was he being given them by the Owens? Did he find them on his own? Any other kind of things that you notice? These are verses from the Quran, great. They definitely are. Great, so you'll do the same thing with students, think about some first impressions, and then you're going to go into the critical translation, which gives a little bit more context for the document that we're looking at. So this is currently held at Chapel Hill in the Wilson Special Collections Library. So it's something that you can go to UNC and you can see physically. Really interesting to think about the history of how the Owens donated it to UNC and how it ended up there in the first place. We can talk a little bit about the concept of provenance with students. So like, how does an object come to be where it is? In this case, it was given to Mary Jones. So it was given to this wife of this reverend. So it was something that the Owens like had and then exchanged that they obviously thought had value or someone would find pretty to put on their wall. And there's a description here. So this is Surat al-Nasr. It's a chapter of the Quran, often translated as the chapter of help. And it's Omar ibn Said's last known existing writing. And really interestingly, a note on the manuscript incorrectly states that it's the Lord's Prayer, which makes us kind of wonder, how did that happen, right? So did Said say that this was the Lord's Prayer? Did they just assume that he was writing biblical verses? Hard to say, but a really interesting question. And we've got a translation here from the Quran. So when the assistance of God shall come and the victory, and thou shalt see the people enter into the religion of God by troops, celebrate the praise of thy Lord and ask pardon of him, for he's inclined to forgive. So I think some really interesting kind of themes here to draw out for students and to ask them. I would ask them perhaps, remember that Said's quoting the Quran from memory here. So enslaved people were not able to bring material objects with them on the middle passage. And what does that tell us about the way that Said was educated, right? That he's reproducing this from memory. And what do we make of Said's use of this chapter of the Quran? And the really cool thing is that students honestly have as good a guess as anyone. Like, why this chapter? What was he trying to say with that? Did he have a way of knowing that this would be preserved and that maybe we would look at this really far into the future? In the autobiography, he sometimes does address like this breaking through the third wall, oh, people of North Carolina, oh, people of South Carolina. So he seems to sometimes have had this idea that his words would be preserved. But it's hard to know how he could have known that or what he would have expected for us to make of them, or if he could even envision us as a particular audience. And then at the end of the document, he specifically just sort of like signs his name, which again, I think is interesting to think about with students in terms of personhood, his conception of self, and the power dynamics that also go into creating this document. So who is actually like asking for this to be created? From the little that we can glean, it seems like the Owen just kind of like to have these up on display as kind of like a testament to their wealth, which is really interesting to think about. If that's the purpose that they have, how is Said interpreting kind of his agency in creating these? And that is sort of the general gist of the Said unit. Any questions before we go into the other unit? So I think there's a lot of really cool material in the podcast to kind of delve into that hopefully will give students some more like specificity about this genre of writing, the idea of what it means to like analyze and think about a manuscript. Again, more of those power dynamics, who he's quoting from. I don't expect that students will get all of this complexity, but I think it's still great to know that just essentially he's also quoting lines from Sufi poets that are centuries and centuries old from memory, not just the Quran. I think particularly we want to kind of like impress upon students the kind of like education that Said had. But any questions before I move into our next unit? Someone said that there's a mosque in Fayetteville. Yes, I really want to visit that. I think that's so cool. And I think that there's sort of been a recent resurgence of interest in Said, but in some places like Fayetteville, that never really went away, which is awesome and appropriate given how much of his life that he spent there. All right, with that, we're going to transition. I'm really excited to hear how this unit plays out in classrooms, and I think that Said's connection to North Carolina makes him a really compelling and powerful figure. We're going to turn next to the immigration unit. And I kind of want to preface by saying that this unit includes Muslims. Absolutely, all of these units are about kind of like Muslim Americans. And I kind of am intentional in that framing, not about Islam, because I think that Islam is a religion. It's a concept that people use in a lot of different ways, but Islam doesn't get up and go to the bathroom, which sounds a little silly, but it's true. Islam as a noun doesn't do things, people do things. And I think that's an important kind of contextualization to give students, just in terms of allowing for them to kind of maybe expand whatever prior knowledge they have or association they have with Islam and with Muslims, and to start thinking about individual people and individual groups of people. And so to that end, this immigration unit is about South Asians and people from the Middle East, in this case, Arabs, who came to the US in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the emphasis here is on pre-1965 immigration, because often after the 1965 Immigration Act passes, which we'll talk about, there's this explosion in non-white, non-European immigration, which is super important. But sometimes that emphasis kind of erases the fact that these folks, or at least representatives from these groups, were in the US for a longer time. And I think that's something really interesting to explore with students. And because this focus is more on immigration, it also includes folks who are not Muslims. So just wanted to kind of note that, particularly when we're talking about South Asians, we're talking about Muslims and largely Sikhs. There also were some Hindus, but it was mostly Muslim and Sikh populations that were from South Asia that were immigrating in this time. And when we're talking about Arabs, we're talking about Muslims, but we're actually talking mostly about Christians. There are mostly Christian Arabs who are immigrating and small pockets of Muslim Arabs. So those are the people that we're talking about. And we'll talk a little bit about the overview and the essential questions together before we get into some of the really fun materials. So this two-day unit focuses on early South Asian and Middle Eastern immigration. The unit highlights the cultural background of Punjabi Sikh immigrants, Muslim Bengali immigrants, and Arab immigrants. Students will review American immigration law and consider the complicated connection between race and citizenship. The unit demonstrates that immigrants' religious and cultural beliefs both adapted to and change in the American context. So I think that's really key. We're thinking both about the beliefs that people bring with them, sort of similar, honestly, a little bit to the Said unit, but also the ways that they change in an American context, and how this influences the larger fabric of life in the United States. So yes, these are very specific populations, but there's a reason why we're kind of keeping that specificity. Essential questions for the first day is, how does law influence our understanding of citizenship? What does it mean to be a citizen? How does one become a citizen? And the second day is a lot of fun. What can we learn about a group of people through their art? So we'll be looking specifically at a really great website, which leads us through some Arab art forms, Arab American art forms. The pre-unit homework starts with a map quiz. I'm not gonna lie, maps have never been my strong suit, and I think it's for that reason that we need map quizzes, including myself. So students will have to identify some countries in South Asia, and we want to emphasize that these countries are contemporary nation states. So without going into too much detail, just kind of letting them know that at the time of immigration, people would have been immigrating from then British colonial India, but it's helpful for them to know where these countries are now today on a map to have an idea of kind of what part of the world that we're talking about. So in this case, we're talking about people coming from South Asia. So that's going to include Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Largely, we're talking about folks who would be immigrating from countries that are now contemporarily Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And we're talking about the Middle East. We're talking about areas that have countries and territories which contemporaneously would be called Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And so we're going to start with a review of the legal immigration acts that had the most influence on the groups that we're talking about. And I wish that this is something I had gotten earlier in my history personally. And I'm sure that y'all are all superstars, so a lot of your students are getting it now. But I just don't think I knew growing up that you had to be white or Black to be a citizen for so much of American history. And I think that puts a lot of contemporary ideas of race in a lot of context. And so it's worth really slowly going through these acts with students. We won't model the group activity here, but I'll just kind of read off the summaries. So the Nationality Act of 1790 limits citizenship to white Americans, sets a precedent for citizenship being tied to whiteness. Then in 1870, the law extends to African Americans, but it creates a binary where citizens can only be white or Black. So you can imagine if someone's coming from South Asia, coming from the Middle East, this poses a really confusing problem, right? To sort of understand how you're a citizen, you have to essentially argue that you fall into one of these two categories. Then we got the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and this was the first law to single out and specifically target a particular group, and its ramifications were really hugely influential on all Asian Americans, or all Asians in the US who were seeking to become Americans, even though it targeted in particular Chinese Americans. And then we have the Immigration Act of 1924, which establishes restrictive quotas, further limits immigration, and makes immigration from non-European countries very difficult. So essentially, you have a lot of folks who kind of get stuck here. They aren't able to be mobile in the same ways that they were, or as we'll see, they have to be more creative about being mobile. They have to find ways that they can kind of come to the US, do business, and then continue moving back and forth between their country of origin or other countries that they're going to potentially to do business, to sell their goods, that kind of thing. And then you've got the 1965 Immigration Act, which is also included in there and allows for an increase in immigration from non-European countries. So the first day of this unit is focused on South Asian Americans, so primarily Bengali Muslims and Sikh Punjabis. And after learning about these groups through an introductory PowerPoint, students will be broken into groups to explore primary sources that will teach them more about these groups and the way South Asian immigrants became part of the fabric of the US. Part of the interesting part of the story is that the communities that these groups assimilated into. So Sikh Punjabi immigrants, so Sikh is their religion, Punjabi is kind of like their ethnic background, the part of South Asia that they're from, ended up joining a lot of Catholic Mexican communities on the West Coast, which I think is super interesting and a really fascinating microhistory. You just have a lot of people who are coming to an area, they're farming, a lot of them were farmers when they were in South Asia, and they join farming communities that are largely Mexican. They're not able easily to bring wives, it's mostly men that are immigrating, and they end up kind of intermarrying and forming a really interesting alliance. And part of this is based on just kind of probably what makes the most prudent sense. They're both kind of socially brown and seen as being kind of brown, nebulous racial category. But there are really lovely, interesting testimonies of people being like, no, this was meant to happen. Like, we both have spicy food, we have similar dance, which I'm like, I think a lot of cultures have spicy food, but I think it's really sweet that when put together and sort of like put in the same group together, people can find commonalities. And very similarly, we're going to be talking about a group of Bengali Muslims. So that was the West Coast. The Bengali Muslims are mostly coming to the East Coast. So they're coming to the American South, to New Orleans, and also the Northeast. So to Harlem and New York City, to other big cities like Baltimore. And they're often joining African American and Puerto Rican communities. And again, a similar kind of deal of like coalition building based upon what makes the most sense prudently for these groups. So those are the groups that we're talking about. And we have an activity where students will be looking at some primary sources that are put in context by articles. So one of these is on the case of Bhagat Singh Thind and the question of, is he a citizen or an alien? This was ended up being a Supreme Court case in 1923, which kind of led to the 1924 law that restricted immigration and kind of said that Asians were not really able to be citizens. This is a kind of court case summary from the Pluralism Project, which is an awesome resource. We'll probably send that out after this. I'm a little biased, I worked for the Pluralism Project for a while, but it really is helpful. They have a lot of really great kind of summaries, particularly when you're talking about religious diversity in the US. And so students will kind of read this. It's written in really accessible language. about this man. He was a sick man. He came to the US. He actually kind of joins like the US Army, which you'd think would be enough to get him citizenship, but apparently not. He was also involved in anti-colonial agitation against the British. So there's some speculation that that may have been held against him in his citizenship case. But essentially, the Supreme Court says that in the common man's understanding of what it means to be white, this man is not white, which is really interesting because it's not really even giving the pretense that's normally given of scientific racism. It's not really giving any solid evidence at all. It's just saying, like, if you were to look at this person, you would kind of be able to tell that. And that's where the primary sources come in. So we've got a link here that students can actually look at. And I think I've got to share my screen again, probably. I'll do that here. To learn a little bit more about Bhagat and to sort of see him and see kind of like what the Supreme Court is talking about and what they mean when they're using this kind of, highly racialized language. So this is an archive. It's called the South Asian American Digital Archive. We've got a lot of really great resources. And I've got a link in the curricula just to this particular collection of photos about Bhagat Singh. So you can see him styling as a young man. You can see him as an older man, eventually a citizen, which is great. And that in of itself is its own really incredible story, which unfortunately is not included in this curriculum. So yeah, the questions that are there, let's keep in touch. Okay. The questions that are there in the curriculum are just sort of designed to have students kind of enjoy going through these primary sources now that they know a little bit of background about the Supreme Court case to kind of see what else they can learn about him. And when you click on the photographs, there's sort of descriptions. And again, I think kind of fun for students to start thinking about, again, these kind of ideas of like, where is this? Who donated this? This man's last name is Thind. Does he have a connection? Perhaps he does. Those kind of questions I think are really fun for students to think about in terms of like archive and how objects get to be where they are, but also just a great photo. So that is one of our primary sources. Another one is an article. Specifically, it is an article that was written in a newspaper, which I will show you here. Can folks see this screen? Great. So this is a really dramatic title called 6 Indian Seamen Here for Alleged Mutiny. And it's in the Afro-American, which was a Black newspaper, historically Black newspaper. And we've got a little bit of context for this article up here. So we've got an idea that this is an article that was published by a Baltimore newspaper in 1925. So these are primary sources, but basically I'm trying to like let you know that there's some contextualization given there. And about these seamen who are coming from India, who are Muslim, who lead a mutiny because they have poor working conditions, essentially. So they say that their food is not being prepared according to the way that they want it to, which you can see if students have any ideas on what that might mean. My guess is that they were worried they were being served pork, but I don't know that for sure, but that was something I would speculate they were worried about. And we have a quote here from the author of Bengali Harlem about this kind of incident. So talking about Bengali Muslims who often would come to the US either to work as merchants or the second large way was as seamen, so they were working on ships. And he says the 6 seamen were presented here as human beings and specifically as workers of color, whose stories were important and whose actions were logical, reasonable, and even commendable. Their dietary observances were not the focus of ridicule or voyeurism, but rather aspects of their faith that their captain was wrong to deny them. The affinity that the Afro-Americans showed to these Indian mutineers was not isolated. There's a historical moment in which African-American and Indian nationalist leaders were coming to recognize and articulate the connections between their struggle. So again, getting students to think about this idea of coalition. I think sometimes we tend to think about history in really segmented terms, which makes sense. But the idea that when we're talking about immigration, we're still talking about other American groups, right? We're still talking about what kind of communities are groups assimilating into, building connections with, that kind of thing. I think this is a really great example of that, to see why this newspaper kind of covered this event in a really particularly different way than everyone else did in the time period. We also have another group talking about Bengali Muslims in a kind of larger sense, and including sort of these merchants at the time that were immigrating and coming to the US and getting around these immigration laws in really interesting ways. One of which was that they didn't settle permanently in the US. They were always traveling as merchants. So they would go from the US to, say, New Orleans. They would often have like a wife or like a family in New Orleans, and then they would go back to Bangladesh and get more materials to sell. And at the time, there was kind of a hankering for Oriental materials, for like silks or things that looked silk-like, not sure if they were always 100% silk, and shawls and that kind of thing. And so this particular group, in the same way that the Sikhs kind of ended up in a kind of farming, agrarian community, this particular group ended up in a sort of merchant community. And that was the way that they came to the US and immigrated during this time period, when it was really difficult based on legal restrictions to do so. I've got a few more things to say about this unit before we wrap up, but I'm going to pause for questions in case there are any, and I'll take a look at the chat. We have mapping Mondays. Oh, that's awesome. I need to come to your classroom so I can review my geography. Any questions about the immigration unit, about any of the stuff that we've talked about so far before we get into the second day of the unit? All right, great. We'll jump into it then. So second day of the unit is a little bit of a transition. So we're moving from talking about South Asian immigrants to talking about immigrants coming from the Middle East. So these are Arab immigrants, but at the same time period, late 1800s to early 1900s. And it's the same kind of premise in that this is a group that we often talk about in exclusively contemporary terms, that actually has a longer trajectory in the US. And I think that there's a lot of groups outside of South Asians and Middle Easterners that we could do this with that would be really interesting. But those are the groups that I chose. And this is a really fun day. So we're going to be looking at a website called Turath. I'm curious if anyone's used Turath so far. It's based out of NC State. It's a wonderful, wonderful website. They did an amazing job with it. That's all kind of focused on the history of Arab Americans in the US. So I'm going to pull it up here. So you get there, it's very user-friendly. It tells you what it's about. It's about Arabs in America. And you have this exhibit function. So for the purposes of this lesson, we'll be going to exhibit and then music. So you click on exhibit and you click on music. And you have all of these kind of musicians that existed during this time period in the US that had their own kind of little micro communities and record labels and ways of producing things. And I think this is such a fun way to talk to and think about with students. You know, if you were to go somewhere tomorrow, what would you take with you, like in terms of cultural production? What would you take with you in terms of your favorite songs that you would want to make sure got passed on to the next generation? And how might the kind of music that you listen to and the kind of art that you consume potentially be influenced by a new context? And of course, this question might not be abstract for some students. You might have students in your classroom who are immigrants or who are the children of immigrants who've actually kind of thought about some of these things. And if we go to biographies, it's kind of the meat of what we'll be looking at for this day. You have some specific kind of summaries of particular musicians. So let's start with this one, Alexander Malouf. We have a little bit of information about him. He was an established pianist, a composer, a conductor. He wrote music for silent films. He's best known for blending Middle Eastern flair with Western style. So there's Alexander. Again, this is going to be a mix of both Christians and Muslims, which I think it's good for students to see. And in this time period, actually, there isn't that much division between Christian and Muslim immigrants in the same way that there will be in later time periods, perhaps because there's just like smaller numbers of them. Not to say that there's necessarily divisions today, but just to say that there are like really interesting, prominent examples of Christians that are already existing in the community helping fundraise for a mosque to be built and that kind of thing, which is really interesting. Based on the names, we might be able to guess a little bit. So Muhammad al-Bakr, probably Muslim, that kind of thing. I was going to say Tony doesn't sound like it was his name. Maybe it was. And so we've got a bunch of examples here. And there's actually a playlist that you can play some of these songs for students. So if you're looking at Alexander Malouf, you could play this song, America Yahuwah. So America, I think the suite that probably is. I'll play a second of it here, if I can easily. I think we would actually get to a place where he was singing a little bit, which is exciting. And so the idea on this day is that we have students make a poster as if they're advertising for a concert. So they're going to be assigned one of these musicians to make a biography of, and there's plenty to go around. And they're going to want to talk a little bit about what the concert will look like. So one of the concepts we talk about in this unit is at the time, there were haflas, which were parties, and there were mahrajans, which were formal concerts. So one thing they might distinguish in their poster, is this like a party or is this a formal concert? Is this a gathering of Arab Americans that's happening locally, or is it something that's drawing people from across the state, maybe across the region, maybe across the Northeast, across North Carolina? And what is that going to look like? And just kind of getting them to think about the larger question of how art and cultural production sort of shapes group identity. And then if you want to be a little competitive, you can perhaps vote for the best one, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. There are ways that you can flip this around if you want to make it less so that one group is only being focused about in terms of like legal stuff and the other group is being focused on more in terms of like cultural production. There certainly are resources where you could talk about legal challenges that Arab Americans also faced. There are several prominent cases that are really interesting in terms of citizenship. But if you want to just kind of use this website and have the second day be a little bit more fun, I think that works too. Any questions before we go on to the next unit?
Yasmine, actually, I had a question.
Yeah.
For the music during this time, were people singing in English or in Arabic or a mix?
It's a mix. Yeah, it definitely depends. And it depends on the audience. There's some musicians who are actually starting to cater more to non-Arab audiences, but are singing in Arabic because they end up kind of putting on performances that are seen as exotic and interesting. Often these were combined with like belly dancing to music that wouldn't traditionally have been belly danced to. So it really depends on the audience and the context, but it's a bit of a mix.
Awesome.
Yeah, great question.
One other question that I think you had kind of shared with the Bengali and the Punjabi immigrants that they were settling on the west and east coasts. Do you know where these Arab American immigrants were settling?
That's a great question because in large part, the Midwest was a huge place for Arab American immigration, which is super interesting. So you have the first mosque in the US ever. It's called the Mother Mosque, is in Iowa, which just feels kind of awesome and random. I don't know anything about Iowa, but I would love to go visit that mosque one day. You have a lot of Arabs coming to the Dakotas. Yeah, and then also the Northeast too, for sure, but definitely seems like the Midwest. I think particularly Michigan, which still has a huge Arab American population because there's a lot of assembly line work, a lot of factory work with Ford and that kind of thing that drew like a population of immigrants there. And I think it was the sort of thing that once a few people were there, then people had connections and heard from word of mouth that there were Arabs there and it kind of built up. Great question. Any other questions? All right. We're going to get into the last unit, which I think is honestly my favorite because I think that if there's anything I could redo about my particular high school history education, it might have been the way that we covered the Iran hostage crisis. I think that unfortunately this might be some of the only way that students are exposed to Muslims. And I think it's really important that we kind of use this opportunity to think, you know, critically and just kind of like with as much nuance as possible. And that'll also make it more interesting and exciting for students, hopefully. But this is also the one unit that could arguably be taught in both an American history and a global history course, up to your discretion, obviously. But I'd be curious to hear if anyone uses it that way. So I'll start off with our essential questions because they're pretty different for the first 2 days. The first day is going to be focused on the hostage crisis. And then the second day is going to be focused on its impact on Iranian Americans because it had a pretty profound impact. And I think it's something really interesting to think about in terms of how events abroad affect people in the US. And so I think that we pretty much covered the overview there. Essential questions for day one: what factors influence political and diplomatic relationships between countries? So what goes into the way that countries perceive each other is a really big question, but I think an interesting one and one we can definitely start to tackle. And two, how do current events influence perception of immigrant communities and the way those communities think about belonging in the United States? So that's a little bit twofold. Like one, how did it, so in this case, how did people think about Iranian Americans after the crisis? But then also, how did that influence the way that Iranian Americans thought about themselves? I think it's kind of helpful to get to both of those points. So we're going to start off with the key terms. A lot of this actually comes from another resource that was already made before me that I'm really grateful for. That is on the UNC Middle East website. So I use that as a resource in my own teaching currently. I use that as a resource. I'm teaching a class on Asian American religions right now. And this is sort of adapted from that. So we've got here some key terms that are kind of good to know. One, just sort of defining what Iran is, where it is, the Iranian Constitutional Revolution, Mohammad Mossadegh, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the revolution, and then Khomeini. And we've got a timeline here which I think is really helpful. This is obviously a little bit of a jump, but I think it's still important for students to know that there are there have been like other kind of cultural contexts and other like governmental formations that have existed in Iran prior to the nation state of Iran, so that there's a really long history there. And even if we're not talking about that longer history in the context of this lesson, a lot of Iranians are certainly thinking about the kind of larger context of their past. We've got the Iranian Constitutional Revolution, and then a couple other sort of instances that we'll be hitting on. So one of the first things that we have students do is watch a video that's actually produced by one of our professors here, Charlie Kurzman, who's an expert on Iran and who actually wrote a really important book, a number of important works about kind of rethinking the Iranian Revolution and the way it was framed. So we're going to actually watch a little bit of that video just together right now, and then think about the kind of questions students will ask and answer based on that video in class. Okay, great. So we're not going to watch all of this, though Charlie is awesome. We're just going to watch some excerpts so we can think about questions that students might ask and answer. So we'll start at 57.
Relations between Iran and the United States go back more than a century to the Iranian Constitutional Revolution of 1906, when Iranians demanded democracy and looked to the United States for support. One of the heroes of the Iranian Constitutional Revolution was Howard Baskerville, an American teacher who joined the revolution and died in battle. And there's a monument to him that I was able to see in Tabriz in northwest Iran. Another American hero of the Iranian. So there were pretty good relations between Iran and the United States the first part of the 20th century. That changed, though, when the United States and Great Britain helped to organize a coup d'etat against a popularly elected prime minister in 1953. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh, and he objected to the British having taken Iranians' oil fields. So he took them back. The British didn't like this, and they called on the Americans to help overthrow Mossadegh, along with elements from the Iranian army. That coup in 1953 is one of the most important moments in Iranian political history. Every Iranian today knows about the American coup of 1953. The coup supported the king of Iran, called the Shah. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was still a young man at that point and had very little power. But after the coup, he gained more and more power. With American help, he built his military, he built his intelligence services, and he built a brutal, repressive apparatus. The Shah's government denied human rights, tortured political prisoners, and refused to allow democratic control.
So we'll have students watch all 7 minutes of that in class. I think that this is probably better done in class than as an at-home activity because it is really complicated history. Even though Charlie does a great job breaking it down, it's really condensed. And we've got these questions that go along with it. And so you can see already those first 3 we would have answered. I think kind of just nice to highlight that there have been Americans that have been kind of held up in Iranian history. So talking about Howard would be great there. And then for 2 and 3, just kind of centering that the coup is something that is really center of mind for Iranians when they're talking about the hostage crisis. That's really connected history that's important to the kind of context of Iranian-American relations, even if that coup isn't highlighted as much necessarily in typical American narratives of the hostage crisis. And we've got some other questions here, but those are the first 3 that would kind of be highlighted by those just a couple of minutes that we watched the video there. So after giving some students some background context, making sure that we're all kind of on the same page about sort of really basic stuff about Iran and about its history as it pertains to this moment that we're going to be talking about, we're going to go into looking at some visual primary sources, which are so much fun and really interesting. So we're going to start off with some political cartoons. We've got one here, and you've got, it's called Hostage. It's by this guy named Herb Block. Was published in the Washington Post, November 15th, 1979. And I think we can kind of start off with just asking students to analyze this, right? So thinking about what is trying to be conveyed here. You know, there's a man, even really simple observations are helpful observations, I find, when we're thinking about visual primary sources. So there's a man, he's tied up. He's like, you know, tied to a gas pump, thinking about the kind of implications that means when we're talking about the Middle East and talking about relationships. Anything else that you would find particularly kind of like striking about this visual image? If anyone wants to jump in the chat, if not, we can keep on going. But if there's anything that you just kind of putting your student hat on might notice about this image that you might find interesting, or that you as an individual find interesting.
Yasmine, could you zoom in just a tiny bit? It's kind of
Yeah,
hard to read what's on the gas pump.
definitely. It's not real subtle, but it's a political cartoon, so it's trying to make a point. U.S. government failure to end dependence on foreign oil seems to be holding this man hostage, which is written out here in case you forgot what that meant. But yeah, really spelling out, I think, what we mean here. Maybe this one is a little bit too intuitive. Let's see if there are some more thoughts for an image is kind of giving an Iranian perspective. So I'm going to zoom out first to kind of tell you more about the image, and then I'll zoom in. So this is an Associated Press photo of the American embassy in Tehran, Iran in 1980. And this, I would like at least one participant. What are some things that you notice about this image? And what does it kind of tell you about what the potential audience might be? So I think the audience of the last image is pretty straightforward, right? It's published in the Washington Post, published in a newspaper. It's a cartoonist who's trying to communicate with an American public about the implications of this terrible crisis and just sort of like the government not acting in a way that he thinks it should be acting. What are some things what is the audience? Let's start with that. What do you think a potential audience or audiences might be of this photograph, of this kind of particular embassy gates, of the things that are written here? So we have Viva Islam. The Viva is interesting. Long live Khomeini. We have a message here to American minorities. We've got a thing that says down with Reagan. I can't make out all of this here, and I don't speak Farsi, but I see Mubarak, which I know means like celebration. Great. So Jean says like talking to American minorities. Great. So I think something we want to kind of get across with students analyzing this photo is that there are multiple audiences, right? And I think that's kind of critical to think about when we're looking at these primary sources. Who are they talking to? So the fact that there's so much English in this picture means that there's some kind of deliberate staging here, right? This is not just for an Iranian audience. This is an Iranian audience that potentially is trying to also communicate with foreign press that are taking pictures of the embassy. So in this case, kind of trying to say like who in the US has common cause with our cause. The Viva Islam. So at the time of the Iranian Revolution, there was a lot of different factions that were influencing it, including socialists, including Muslims who wanted to have a theocratic state, but with very different visions of what that would look like. So sort of a nod there. Yeah, some of the coalition building, right? Very different aims, but definitely somewhat similar. We have another image here from the embassy. So this is graffiti written during the hostage crisis. And in Farsi, it says this den of spies should be closed. And then down here, it says both in English and in Farsi, there is no time for imperialism in Iran anymore. So again, kind of getting from the Iranian perspective, I think that this is their narrative of this crisis is about like past American intervention, and that their sieging of the hostages, they sort of see as like, is seen to by some as sort of like a radical act. And again, obviously hostage crisis was a terrible crisis and an awful tragedy. So not at all diminishing that, but just kind of trying to think about the way that it's being framed in these sources. This is a kind of intense one. So this is a newsletter for students, faculty, and staff at Sharif University, which is a local college in Tehran. It was published sometime in the early 1980s. And the front cover, you got a lot going on. There's like a fist with a photo of Iranian demonstrators, and it's like crushing the embassy, which is made out of the letters USA. And then it's on top of like Carter's head, which is also on top of the flag. A lot of imagery really like crammed in there. And the Farsi writing says special issue of the Sharif University of Technology on the occasion of the pinnacle of the Iranian people's anti-imperialist campaign. So again, that language of anti-imperialism, I think is super interesting. And something for students to think about in terms of how the hostage crisis is being covered in Iran. We've got another source here from the US. So it says, now the latest from Tehran, like a play on like terror and Iran. But I think, again, kind of like capturing this very legitimate sense of like hopelessness that Americans are feeling at this time, this kind of like ineptitude, seeming ineptitude, that this crisis keeps on going on and on. Really kind of like, again, clear messaging, the kind of idea that you see this on the news every day, but it's still like horrific, I think are all things that are really interesting to talk to students about. And I'll leave it there in terms of the primary sources and move on to the second day. which is when we'll talk about the effects of the crisis on Iranian Americans. So this includes a PowerPoint and then some oral history sources that are really great. They're produced by the University of Michigan. I kind of broke them down with questions throughout. They're only about 5 minutes each, but still it might be a lot to just kind of like play that in the classroom. It might be easier to sort of stop it and ask questions as you go. We'll start off with the PowerPoint, and then we'll see if we can listen to a little bit of one of the primary sources. So the PowerPoint here is pretty short and sweet, but I think it's helpful. It also gives a little bit more context of thinking about Iran and sort of Persian culture as a cultural entity. So not just, at the same time as we are focusing on this crisis, trying to broaden it out a little bit. So I kind of framed it as Iranian immigration to the United States, because part of that story of immigration is implicated in the 1979 revolution and in the hostage crisis. But here we've got a photo that's set for Nowruz, which is a Persian New Year celebration. They're always gorgeous. I've only seen a few in person, but they're just stunning. I wish I knew more about all the symbolism. To be honest, I don't know everything that's on the table. I know that I won't pretend that I know. I won't even go into it, but there's a lot of symbolism. I know that much. And it's a celebration of the New Year. So it comes with a lot of foods that have symbolic resonance for that reason. So there have been 3 major waves of immigration to the United States beginning in the middle of the 20th century. So we start with the first wave, which is when there was a large growth of the middle class in Iran as oil revenues were increasing and young Iranians were interested in higher education in order to further their careers. And during this time, US universities offer some of the best programs in engineering, other technical fields. That's still what draws many international students to the US today, of course. And so many Iranian immigrants in this wave were specialists in engineering or medicine. And American immigration law at the time also prioritized giving visas to technically skilled applicants as opposed to more working class people. So we have a lot of folks kind of immigrating who are from more affluent backgrounds. That's our first wave. Then we can talk a little bit about the impact of the Iranian Revolution. I love this photo. I just think it's so striking and interesting. So by the mid-1970s, there were more foreign students from Iran and America than any other nation group. So a ton of Iranians are in the US taking classes. Just kind of interesting to note that in 1979, Iranians were legally classified as white according to the United States Census. And then later that year, the Iranian hostage crisis made many Americans start to view Iranians as foreign and a threat. It's just kind of an irony in that timing, that there's sort of a switch that happens there. And many students and visitors who kind of were in the US at that time from Iran intended to return, but weren't able to because of the revolution, either because they didn't match the politics of the Iranian Revolution, because they were afraid to go home, because there was turmoil, a myriad of reasons. There were also 50,000 Iranian students studying at American universities at the time that were sort of subjected to extra criticism. They sort of underwent a lot of screening. A lot of students were deported. Interestingly enough, actually, and this is not in the PowerPoint, but just kind of a point of note, is that the NCERS program that was formed after 9/11 in some ways just kind of modeled on this. So there are later forms of extra security done by the state that seem to have had their kind of origins in this particular event. So in this photo, you've got international students filling out immigration forms. And then you have a second wave of immigration. So because of the revolution, you have a lot of folks who are trying to get out of the country because it doesn't go in the direction that they thought that it would or they wanted it to. Immigrants who come from this time period are also still primarily middle and upper class families. Many are political refugees and exiles. It also includes a lot of ethnic and religious minorities who feared persecution, and then families associated with the previous government, as well as political dissenters. And then we've got a note on our present wave, which also includes another Nowruz table just for fun. There are also some parts of this curriculum that include notes on Iranian Americans in North Carolina, which I think will help us be a little bit more tangible to those of you who are in North Carolina for students to think about. But just that after 9/11, it was a little bit harder for Iranians to attain refugee visas, that there have been different laws that have affected Iranian American immigration, including President Trump's administration's travel ban, but that President Biden has since overturned that ban. So kind of an ongoing story. And the last thing we're going to do, and I will only play you a minute of it because I know we've had a lot of jumping around in terms of sharing screen and y'all have been great. And I want to leave time for questions if there are questions, is look at one of these oral sources, because I think that that is a really fun way to kind of make people's stories feel a little bit more tangible, is to actually kind of hear them talk. So we're going to listen to Mahmoud Moulmian, who was born in Tehran in 1938, and then found himself in Michigan because he was one of these folks who was not able to go back to Iran, even though it seems that he intended to. So we'll just listen to a minute of his story together.
My name is Mahmoud Moulmian, and when I got the citizenship, I added Mark to it, so it's Mark Mahmoud Moulmian, and I was born in Tehran, Iran, in 1938. I came to US and Michigan basically on 1976. And ever since, except a couple of years which I was out of Michigan, I've lived in Michigan. I started going to school at MSU, and I did my master's degree.
So I'm going to pause there for the sake of time, but he goes on to talk about how he wasn't able to go home because he was afraid about the implications of the revolution, but how he started a kind of like food club at MSU, which kind of brings together people to celebrate holidays like Nowruz. And it was kind of a way for him, he says, to sort of stay connected to his culture and to kind of create a new sort of hybrid identity as someone who now identifies as American and, you know, change his name to Mark, which is a really interesting thing that you could talk to students about the implications of that and why certain groups do that, certain groups don't, but wanted to remain kind of tied culturally to Iran. One of the other oral interviews is with a woman who came to the US to study to be a doctor, was afraid that she wouldn't be able to kind of have the same advantages in post-revolutionary Iran, didn't go back. And she has some interesting conversations about how she has stayed in touch with family there and kind of trying to bridge that gap with family of very different political persuasions, which I'm sure a lot of us in the US can also identify with. Some of who did support the revolution, but that she, you know, is able to sort of stay in contact with them in spite of really not supporting the revolution and feeling that she wasn't able to go back to Iran for that reason. And she similarly kind of starts a poetry club, which kind of is a way that she stays connected to her heritage and kind of creates new ways of connecting with the next generation in Michigan. And I think I'll end there, actually. I think that there's like more detail in the curricula for sure, but just kind of wanted to give you a taste of it and go over some of the content together. And I really appreciate y'all being so engaged, and just any questions at all that you have, I'd love to answer to the best of my ability. I've done some research on Omar bin Said with Professor Carl Ernst, so I've translated some of the documents and just really enjoyed that material. I've gotten a chance to talk to some high schools in the area around me in the Triangle, and have found that the material about Omar bin Said really resonates. So that unit was kind of like material that it felt comfortable to me that I wanted to talk about. I'm currently teaching a class on Asian American religion, which made me think a little bit about the immigration unit, and sort of how we broaden typical narratives of immigration. Particularly, I found that a lot of my students who are Asian American themselves are really excited to learn about these longer trajectories in the US of populations that they're familiar with, but thought that they were only had more recent histories. And I think that they're also, in my experience, my students have been really receptive to kind of unsettling narratives in terms of like, you know, assimilation, the fact that some of these populations were really transient, like the Bengali Muslims. And is that why we maybe don't hear about them as often? Because they kind of don't fit like our standard narratives. Also, the fact that not every Asian American group in this time period was able to create like an ethnic enclave the way that we have like a Chinatown, but that they still kind of created coalition and community in different ways. And then the Iranian unit was definitely the most outside of my comfort zone, but I just know that from my education in high school, that was the only time I remembered learning about Muslims. And so I thought it would be cool to kind of think about how we could sort of broaden that story a little bit. And then I happened to read a really wonderful book called The Limits of Whiteness, which was about Iranian Americans and the way that they are kind of classified racially, which made me sort of think more about the effect of the Iranian Revolution in the US. on Iranian Americans, and thought that might be helpful to include. I think I know less about how this would fit into the context of high school curriculum. So this is something I would need like a lot of feedback on. Like another reason why I chose these 3 units is I ended up talking to a lot of teachers who were like really awesome at being like, oh, I could fit this in here. Like this would work with this stage of our curriculum. But I think it'd be interesting to talk about the Nation of Islam, just because it's a form of Islam, but it is its own kind of organization with its own history. And I think it ends up shaping a lot of how contemporary Muslim Americans relate to the kind of idea of an American Muslim identity. I think it's also just an interesting kind of, not counterpoint to the civil rights movement. I don't want to say that because I think that's how I was taught it, but it's actually more complicated than that. But an interesting part of that story in terms of the history of Black separatism, this idea of a kind of potentially separate state, which ends up really kind of realizing itself more in a much more everyday form in terms of economic opportunities within cities where the NOI is based. And then the NOI kind of at the end of its trajectory, a lot of people convert to Sunni Islam. And so that story is a really interesting one. And I think just maybe a story that would add some complexity to the way that we talk about civil rights. But I don't know enough about how that would fit into what teachers are already talking about in their classrooms. So I run an Instagram page called American Islamicate, which I'll throw in the chat here, that just is kind of like dedicated to small snippets of Muslim American life. Our kind of like time period is from 1528 to 2010, so it's a history page. We've got the Mother Mosque we talked about here, which are the Arab Americans that formed a mosque in Iowa. We've got some documents from Omar bin Said. We've got some other really interesting groups like the Ahmadiyya, which were South Asian Muslim missionaries that wanted to spiritually colonize the Western world and ended up converting a lot of folks coming from the Great Migration in Chicago. Alexander Russell Webb, who was the first kind of prominent white convert and kind of thought that Islam kind of answered a lot of like spiritual questions that he had. Just a whole lot of other resources, including some fun music like videos. So it could be a fun thing to share with students. I know I've used some Instagram pages in the classroom, including one called Hindu History, which is about actually ways that people have talked about Hinduism, less than about Hinduism itself. So it's HINDOO. And I was kind of inspired by that and a couple of other pages that I like to kind of talk a little bit about the history in the US. We've also got some stuff that's not talked about as often. So a prominent Muslim LGBTQ organization that started in the US. And the whole idea is kind of to talk about the sort of diversity and complexity of the history of Muslims in the United States, to try and give like a really large swath of life, whether that's snippets of poetry, pictures of mosques, and different groups are included in that as well. So yeah, if anyone's interested, hope that you get a chance to check that out.
Awesome, Yasmine. Thanks so much for sharing. I think it's really an amazing resource and helps, yeah, as you said, provide these little vignettes, I think, that can supplement some of these lessons or just be used in the classroom to spark conversation.